August 28th, 1926. Around sundown on the north end of Washington Avenue in downtown Deridder, Louisiana, two plainly dressed men, 23-year-old Joe Genna and 24-year-old Molton Brasseaux, hailed a cab in the balmy southern heat. The Tin Lizzie, driven by 47-year-old Joseph Brevelle, slowly drives away with Genna and Brasseaux on a tragic head-on collision with a grim fate. Brevelle had been born in Natchitoches Parish to a Confederate Civil War veteran on February 6, 1879. He had married Ollie Mae Shoemaker in Pollock, Louisiana, and the two had settled down in Deridder and had a son named James in 1915. Brevelle worked as an insurance agent and then as a delivery driver until finally taking a job driving a cab. In those days, Deridder was grappling with the collapse of farm prices and the timber bust of the early 1920s, and jobs had all but dried up around the area. Brevelle was something of a local fixture around Deridder and was well known and liked around town. Many described him as straightforward and honest, and just an all-around good and decent man who was simply trying to make ends meet during hard times. For roughly 5.5 miles, the Ford Model T makes its way down a two-lane gravel road through the segregated black district of town on the eastern side of the tracks towards the old Overland Road. This was before roads were paved outside of the city limits, and the posted speed limit at that time was a paltry 15 miles an hour for automobile traffic. And folks were quite happy with traveling at what they considered such a high rate of speed, compared to horse-drawn wagons, which were still a common sight around the area in those days, that only traveled about as fast as a brisk walk, if even that. The two men had claimed to be going to visit a friend, whom they said lived in an isolated farmhouse about 6 miles down the Overland Road. Turning off the main road to Lake Charles, on the Overland Road, the car proceeds for about 3 more miles, before Genna, who was seated in the back, asked Brevelle to pull over so that he could relieve himself. Back then, the Overland Road was an extremely isolated 2-lane dirt road that cut through the wilderness, but only a few small farmhouses between the outskirts of Deridder and the town of Overland about 40 miles away in Allen Parish. As the Ford Model T taxi comes to a gradual stop, Genna abruptly strikes Brevelle in the back of the head with the leaf spring that was lying on the rear floorboard of the cab. Still conscious from the blow, the startled cab driver is then sucker punched in his right eye by Brasseaux. But they are stunned when the severely wounded man begins to fight back, and the two men brutally pounce on him. Somehow Brevelle manages to break loose from the men in the vehicle and staggers back into the road, his head bleeding and his right eye swelling, as the two men charge at him. But Brevelle puts up a fierce fight and manages to land a hard right punch to Genna's right jaw that rattles him, nearly knocking his jaw out of alignment and busting a back tooth. Brevelle is then tackled by Brasseaux, who struggles against the stronger cab driver and is nearly overwhelmed by Brevelle, who lands 2 solid blows on him before Genna yanks him back and stabs him in the chest with a knife, then brutally slashes his throat. Fatally wounded, Brevelle slumps over into a pool of his own blood and quickly dies in the dirt on that dark, desolate road, with only the ghostly headlights of the vehicle and a chilling pinched moon peeking through the dark trees. The two confessed killers would later claim that they were only planning to rob Brevelle and had no intentions of killing him, but that he was a tougher nut to crack than they had anticipated. Genna and Brasseaux searched through Brevelle's billfold money satchel, but only find a total of $14, which comes out to a sum of just under $250 in our own time. It had been a comparatively slow day for the now deceased husband and father, and the men were expecting him to be carrying a far heftier sum. After some struggle, the two men managed to load Brevelle's lifeless body into the back seat of the cab, and the two drive away from the scene with Genna in the driver's seat, leaving Brevelle's bloodied hat behind in the dust on the road as they head back towards Deridder. The basic layout of the local road network has changed very little over the last century, and a few miles down the road, they turn onto the old Pickering Mill Road and head towards the Pickering Sawmill. It was one of the few still left in operation in the area after the timber bust of the early 1920s. The two killers quickly dump Brevelle's body in the sawmill pond and speed off into the night, as an ominous half-moon glares down like an angry, sad ghost, haunting the dark, grim Louisiana sky. Brevelle's two killers briefly returned to Deridder later that night to retrieve their clothes and what meager belongings they had, then proceeded to Toulouse in LaSalle Parish to meet up with two women, Katie and Edna Souter, who were sisters that the two men had known for some time, and they intended to head to Texas with them, but the women were arrested not long afterwards for car theft, and Brasseaux fled town, first going to Monroe to try to borrow money from an old acquaintance, then returned to his home in Sulphur, Louisiana. Brevelle's blood-stained hat and a piece of cloth torn from his shirt was later found at the crime scene by a nearby farmer who brought it into the Beauregard Parish Sheriff's Office after hearing of Brevelle's murder. The hat and torn cloth was taken in as evidence, still covered in Brevelle's blood. A handkerchief was also found at the scene, but had nothing to do with the Brevelle murder. Not much was known about the two men prior to the Brevelle murder. Genna was originally from Lake Charles, and Brasseaux was from Arthur, Louisiana. The two had met up in Beaumont, Texas, and drifted into town in search of work. After the collapse of the timber industry across East Texas and West Louisiana in the early and mid-1920s, it is said that they did odd jobs for a few cents a day between Sulphur and Deridder, but had struggled just to stay afloat in a region that had fallen on hard times after the timber bust and the fall in farm prices that hit rock bottom in the early years of the restless decade. After parting ways with Brasseaux, Genna in the meantime lingered around and later broke the women out of jail, and the three returned to Deridder, where they picked up a longtime friend, Harvey Perkins, and left out for Texas. Brevelle's Ford Model T was later found in a thicket off the side of the road on the eastern banks of the Sabine River. Genna had set fire to the vehicle, and he and the rest of the group had crossed over into Texas. Brevelle's body had been found on the 30th of August by two boys in Vernon Parish while they were cane pole fishing in the old Pickering Mill pond. They say when Brevelle's wife Ollie was told of Brevelle's gruesome murder, she and her son James were understandably devastated, and that Ollie collapsed on the front porch and was inconsolable. Joseph Joe Brevelle was laid to rest in a quiet and simple ceremony in Woodlawn Cemetery on the west side of Deridder. There's some speculation over just how the case was broken in such a short time. It's often been suggested that authorities received a tip from one of the Sadler's sisters or from Perkins, or that someone who knew Brasseaux tipped off authorities. What is known for sure is that Brasseaux was arrested and charged with Brevelle's murder and confessed to his part in a heinous crime not long afterwards, and named Genna as the main culprit in the vicious killing. Genna was then arrested between Orange and Beaumont, Texas, and brought back to Deridder, where he broke down and confessed to the heinous killing, but pointed the finger at Brasseaux for the actual stabbing and murder of Joseph J. Brevelle. Both men were tried separately, and within 3 days were both quickly found guilty of the brutal murder and sentenced to death by hanging on October 15, 1926. Over the next year and a half, both Genna and Brasseaux would file motions of appeals, with Genna claiming that he had been convicted by a tainted jury, and Brasseaux copying an insanity plea. Both appeals were quickly denied, and their convictions and death sentences were upheld. A day before their sentences were scheduled to be carried out, Genna managed to get his hands on a bottle of pills and attempted to take his own life by overdosing. The exact substance has been lost to history, but the medication didn't have the desired effect and simply made Genna seriously ill. At around sunup the following morning, both men were granted their last meals, which consisted of bacon, eggs, and toasted bread, and served up with a glass of fresh milk. Genna, still sick from his failed overdose attempt the previous day, was in no mood to eat, and Brasseaux was too distraught by his own impending execution than to do more than take a few bites. By 11 that morning, a small crowd had gathered outside to watch the impending execution, and a pastor was brought in to console the two condemned men and prayed with them for their eternal salvation. There's some dispute over the name of the ministry, but the condemned men were granted their chance to repent for their sins in the last hour or so before they were to meet their Maker. The local and regional press was also granted access to the jail to cover what would be Deridder's first and only executions, and reported that the convicted murderers both seemed to be quietly regretting their involvement in the murder of Joseph J. Brevelle. With the grim but decisive flip of a coin a few hours before, Genna would be the first to ascend the spiraling staircase to face the hangman's noose. It was a clear 78-degree Friday just after noon on March 9th, as Genna made the 8 steps up a simple 3.5-foot high wooden platform that had been assembled at the top of the bell house of the jail on the edge of the stairwell. A noose that had been strung over a steel support bar and hung ominously from the ceiling was placed around his neck by Deputy Jim Crumpler, who was serving as Genna's hangman, and the condemned man was allowed a few final words. Then a dark pillowcase that had been dyed black was slid over his head. Genna was given a slight nudge, and then he quietly stepped off the platform and met his grim end at approximately 12:55 p.m. A short time later, Brasseaux was escorted up the shadowy staircase by Deputy Jim Gill to the bell tower, and was allowed his own few last words of remorse. Then a black pillowcase was lowered over his head, along with the noose. It said when pressed, Brasseaux hesitated for a moment, but the Gill shoved him off the platform, and at around 15 minutes after 1 that afternoon, Brasseaux met his own grim fate at the bad end of the rope. After a brief final examination, the men's bodies were placed into crude wooden caskets built from rough lumber and marked with their initials to avoid any confusion. It is said that the Brasseaux family paid to have his casket taken out from a more discreet location, while Genna was taken out the front entrance of the jail in full view of the press and public. The caskets containing the 2 deceased murderers were placed into the backs of 2 separate trucks and hauled away to their final resting places. Genna was quietly buried in Lake Charles, and Brasseaux was entombed in Erath, Louisiana, in Vermilion Parish. Today, the tragic and heartbreaking story of the grisly murder of Joseph J. Brevelle has been somewhat obscured by the more widely publicized public hangings of his two ill-fated killers and the bizarre and fanciful campfire ghost stories revolving around the legendary Deridder Gothic Jail that have been told across western Louisiana for nearly a century now. It's been almost 100 years since Brevelle's blood first soaked the dry dust, and his life was taken from him on that dark Louisiana back road. But the saddest and most chilling truth about every bit of it is that he was killed in cold blood by two mediocre and unremarkable men, simply for trying to earn an honest living and provide for his family on that hot summer night of August 28, 1926. "41-year-old Brian Keith Tribune went missing on August 6, 2023, after fleeing the scene of a motor vehicle accident on Nell Oilfield Road, a few miles east of Maryville, Louisiana. Brian is around 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed around 176 pounds at the time he was last seen, running into the woods moments after the traffic accident. Authorities say Brian may have been in possession of narcotics at the time he went missing, but that his safety and well-being should be first and foremost in the hearts and minds of the community. Brian is said to have grown up around the Maryville area and loved sports, namely baseball and fishing, and was very close to his family and well liked around the Maryville area. His life had taken a few twists and turns, and he struggled with substance abuse and bouts of depression. He had been trying to turn his life around after spending some time in jail. Brian is said to have been a caring and thoughtful individual, but that he had most likely slipped back into the darkness and pain of addiction. No matter the circumstances of his disappearance, his family and the people who knew and loved him simply want his safe return, or at least closure, so that they can rest easy knowing the truth of what happened to him.
There was a written notice above him, which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."